Hello everyone. So thank you for joining our Korean language webinar today. And unfortunately, today is the fifth and the final session of this week's event with Professor Jiun Khae. In recent 4 days, we have heard and discussed the several aspects of Korean language in politeness with the full backgrounds in Neo-Confucianism, addressing people, and power and solidarity. Today's lecture will be about conflict, tension, and humor. And we would like to welcome two speakers today, Associate Professor Jiun Khae at the University of Oxford and Miss Loli Kim. And Loli is a PhD student working with Professor Jiun Khae. Please let me hand over to Jiun.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Even if the weather is so nice, so you're tempted to go out and have a nice time outside, like my background. But thank you for joining us today. So we are today, myself and Lori will be able to talk about conflict and tension and humor. Lori, would you be able to start? And the way how we will talk together, but Lori will present the slides.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so maybe I'll go back. Yep. So today, as Dr. Kier said, we'll be talking a little bit about conflict and tension, and especially how this can result in sometimes complex and interesting meaning potential in Korean films, and frequently humor. So before we can really talk about that, it's important to discuss the common forms of invisibility in the verbal and nonverbal language that we encounter in Korean films, because the language and also the cultural contexts that allow it to mean one way or another are frequently made by these conflicts and by these tensions. So to summarize, probably the key aspects of this, as I'm sure you may have heard in the previous talks, are address terms and speech styles. And for nonverbal expressions, hand gestures, haptic gestures, touch and skinship, bowing and nodding, posture, eye gaze, and of course, there are just a few, there's so many. And then the cultural contexts that allow each of these expressions to mean different things. The cultural context, which is Confucianism. So because of hierarchy and also the place, occasion, and who is observing these social dynamics take place, then allow a particular gesture to mean a variety of different things.
Yeah, so this is kind of something that we discussed in the last few days. So like, the verbal and non-verbal and cultural elements all together. And a film is kind of a wonderful place where we can actually we are able to pick up examples and to see how these complex different factors work together. But but then actually today Lori is mainly presenting, but it's very interesting, like from Korean perspective, like, as we talk about, I talked last 4 days as a Korean perspective, like these things actually show how, interpersonal dynamics realize in different verbal and non-verbal aspect. But if you don't know Korean very much, that, these are something altogether invisible, and perhaps non-verbal elements you may be able to acquire as you watch Korean film or dramas, but verbal, non-verbal, this complexity probably are altogether invisible, because when you think about subtitles, as we have discussed before, very little information can be translated from Korean into English. One thing that we found very interesting is that somehow, like, many of you here perhaps interact with Korean people in through texting or through Twitter or the social media. This is very interesting space that, although we're not going to talk about today, is where actually it's kind of the hierarchical elements very difficult to become visible, like verbal element or non-verbal element, probably some emoji, but so some emoji may be sensitive, but still, like, when you do social media, Twitter, it's kind of very difficult to see those hierarchical elements that we discussed. So I think this is another very interesting space in terms of Korean communication. But anyway, we'll talk about this later.
Perhaps I should leave this slide for you, Dr.
Yeah.
Kia, because you know what you previously discussed with them.
Again, like, these sort of very much no confusion, relational dynamics. No confusion is, very, like, there's a lot of things to talk about, but what we discussed in this lecture series is five relational dynamics: parents, children relation, and master servant relation, and husband wife relation, and also sibling relation, and old and young relation. Again, like, every relation has sort of like clear meaning. Who is the senior and who is the junior? And that dynamic is very much powerful, not only in pre-modern Korea in 17th century Joseon dynasty, but as we watched some of the clips, even now it's very clear. But it's again like seniority is not something that always dominating. The intimacy and power and intimacy work together. So for example, like your granny in your household would be the most senior person because it's old and and is older than anybody else in your household. But still, if it's your granny, you can have some intimate relationship and you can be casual and formal. So this again, like the relational dynamics within family with someone who is very close to you could be different from the relational dynamics who are not very close to you. So this is where problem starts, that because linguistically, both in verbal and non-verbal level in Korean, it really shows how the other person think about you, whether he or she is thinking you as a close friend or not. It's so clearly visible in Korean language. So this is kind of very tricky, but although that's not translatable in English. But anyway, these five relational dynamics we discussed with some of the few examples that's still working in Korean language. Later in the final slide in this talk, I talk about this Park Seung-bin a little bit. So like, we want sort of more equality and justice, linguistic justice in one sense, but there's still what I'm trying to say, we're trying to say is that these five dynamics, relational dynamics is still on, but we kind of, push forward to something more representing linguistic justice and equality. And the address terms, we talk about, we spend a lot of time in lectures on Wednesday. Again, like finding the proper terms is not very straightforward because, again, as I said, very difficult to, you don't want to offend someone, but at the same time, you don't want to be too close. So it's very much, again, like personal choice. In English, it's quite easy because you have the second person pronoun you, and you don't have so many address terms, but in Korean, you really need to find out the right address terms. And this sort of suffix like 님 is quite useful because it kind of shows that I'm respecting you. And then so many times you have job, whatever job you have, plus 님, showing to make somehow a new address term. It's quite interesting. Last year when I was listening to one of the interviews that done by director Bong Joon-ho, who got interviewed so many times because of his film Parasite. So many English people, the interviewers in America or Canada or US, UK, they address him as Director Bong. So instead, I was quite surprised because people would, you may expect someone like, okay, Professor so-and-so or Dr. so-and-so, but otherwise you just call someone's name. In English, you don't, call someone like that driver or someone, director someone. But it was quite interesting that those English speakers address Bong Joon-ho as Director Bong all the way through, to the point like it becomes so funny. You don't do like actor, song, or but somehow what we realized is that from Western perspective, I think somehow they realize the Korean people use of address term is so important, so that if you call someone like Bong Joon-ho, not like Joon-ho or Bong, but by calling him like Director Bong, they kind of know that Director Bong would feel happy or feel more respected. So I think it is very much like Korean thing, but started to be known to the wider world because probably now influence of Korean wave and so on. And the speech style, we talk about there's six styles, contemporary Korean. I mean, there are more, But again, in pre-modern time, it was easy because the class determines speech styles. But 20th century, when the class system disappeared, then we had the opportunity to make more equal language, but this didn't really happen. And so Heyo, second polite style, and half talk, intimate style, these two are most frequently found in spontaneous speech. But again, it sounds very simple, but to find which one is really the one for the interlocutor relation, between the two people, is not so straightforward. And a lot of time people switch from one to the other rather than using the same style. You kind of switch from one to the other to make the dialogue flow better and to kind of have some, it's a kind of tug of war between the two people. Then that audible sort of speech styles. So 존댓말 and 반말, these two things very much can be simplified. But as I said many times, this is something that very much like, you don't do it all the time. Mathematical calculation is something that more instinctively you can tell which one is which, and something that language acquisition wise, young children aged 2.5-year-old can tell which one is which, and they are able to use that. For example, like, you will never hear young children started use 존댓말, polite style to their sibling, no matter how old the other sibling is. But they will feel uncomfortable to use intimate style if they are not siblings. So they understand the dynamics, who they can be able to use intimate style or not, who they can actually, and to be able to use intimate style, informal style, means that you find that person comfortable. So really also shows your psychological status. If you feel someone really comfortable, you're able to use intimate style too. So it really shows, your relational dynamics very much, as it is. So you can't lie, you have to really express.
So to kind of give you a definition of what we mean by conflict, conflict comes in as a mechanism for meaning making in a variety of ways. The first way, these are the ways that we've seen in our analysis. The first way is conflicting hierarchies. So, unlike junior-senior relationships, it's not only a case of is it polite or not, as Dr. Kier just said with speech styles, because both interlocutors have seniority in their own right. So this makes the potential for more diverse meaning potential, like, in consideration and discomfort and things that would just never happen when, a junior knows their place and a senior knows their place, or if they step outside of that, then they're just being rude. The second is excessive politeness or excessive rudeness, but it tends to be more excessive politeness because excessive rudeness just comes across as rude. And this can have a host of meanings like sarcasm, persuasion, desperation, confusion, somebody being drunk even because, they're being insanely polite at a moment where it's really inappropriate. And the final kind of conflict that we encounter, that we've encountered is in the misalignment of verbal and non-verbal expressions. So again, this causes a conflict because of essentially inconsistency and things being out of line with each other. And it's often used strategically in Korean films to show, insincerity, again, insanity, or an inner struggle within the person. So complex emotions, things outside of just kind of the more basic meanings. And we will give you some examples of those in a moment. The second thing we're going to look at is intercultural tension and humor, because in intercultural interactions, these tensions tend to come out more because of the gap between cultures. So even between, for instance, Korean and Korean Americans, we're going to show you how humor can come out of the things they don't know about each other, the things they misunderstand about each other. And particularly how they relate to each other or don't relate to each other tend to drive humorous moments. So the first examples we'll give are intercultural tension and humor. I have to apologize. I did have a clip of this, but the sound was really awful. So right before I joined, I decided to change it for an image. So I'll just explain this film and what's going on in this scene. So this is actually a French film, but it's mostly set in Korea. So there's a lot of Korean language and culture, and that's being interacted with by a Frenchman, but who often speaks English so that he can get his point across, because he feels that English is going to be more accessible than speaking French. And the film's basically about a chef who on a whim travels to South Korea to meet a Korean woman that he's fallen in love with on Instagram. But when he shows up at the airport, she doesn't come. So he's kind of abandoned there in this sea of culture and language, and he doesn't have a clue what's going on, and he's being assaulted by ajumas at the airport, and he can't order simple meals, and it's very funny. But there's one particular scene in the film which is quite a good way to explain this tension. And basically what happens is he wants to order duck, and he knows that they're not going to understand the French word for duck. So he uses the English word, but because he uses French pronunciation, which sounds more like duck, it becomes more and more difficult for him to get his point across. And what you have on the one hand is this tension between the Korean waitress, who is really trying hard to understand him but can't, and also between the French language and the English language, because English speakers who have some knowledge of French know that duck isn't a French word. They also know that that particular pronunciation isn't the English pronunciation, and they can see the struggle going on for the character and for the waitress simultaneously, and it stimulates empathy for him because of the situation he's in, and also it's quite funny, and it results in him in the end having to literally imitate being a duck in order to order the food. And it's this kind of tension that we see a lot in Korean in films that involve Koreans and other languages and cultures, and the moments that create humor. So for this one, I've got a clip. This is a similar situation. I'll just show you I'll tell you about the film first. This clip's from the film Minari, which came out in 2020, and you've probably heard about it on the news and in the media because it's been quite successful. And the film's basically about the Yi family, who are a Korean immigrant family that have lived in America for a little while, had their children in America, and then they moved to Arkansas to start a new life. And they go to work at a chicken sexing factory. And this clip shows their new employer introducing them to a group of people from various East Asian cultures, which they don't specify. There's one Korean person there, the rest are from other East Asian cultures. And the employer introduces them in a very kind of loud and friendly way, and gives them a round of applause, to which nobody responds with anything, because it's a kind of because of the gap in cultures and the way of introducing people, and that creates humor. So I'll just share with you the clip. So.
We have no sound.
Is there no sound? I'm so sorry. Let me try it again. Can you hear it now?
Sorry, no. When you screen share, did you click on the share sound function on the actual screen share?
It just said screen share and it had a number on it. Should I try again?
Yeah, try it one more time. When you click on it, when you're at the bottom of the screen, there's usually like a little tick box for sharing computer sound.
Okay, right. Let me just start that again. I'm so sorry about that. Let's see. Ah, okay, I can see the problem. Thank you so much. Oh. Is that okay?
All right, listen up, everyone. Now, this here is Mr. Jacob, and this is Monica Yee. Mr. Yee is an expert chicken sexer. He's worked in California and Seattle, so let's give him a big Arkansas welcome. Fine. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we could hear that.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, it's all good.
Oh, could you? I'm so sorry. Could you hear the film? Because as soon as it came on, the sound completely went, and I couldn't hear you.
Yeah,
heard
you're
it,
fine.
yeah.
We could
It's
hear
fine.
it. We could
Thank
hear.
you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I've worked out how to do it now. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, I'll just reshare. Okay, so you saw the clip. That's good. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully you heard what happened, but yeah. So basically, the gap between the two cultures and how they might behave in the same situation creates tension, which appears awkward and then makes humor. And then in another scene from Minari, a similar thing happens again, except for in this case, the Yi's son David is with his grandmother, who's just come from Korea, and she doesn't know how to speak English very well. She knows some phrases, some words, and she wants to make him feel good about himself and compliment him, but she uses the word pretty without knowing the kind of gender association of that word. And because of the multiple incidents that are like this in the film, there's growing tension between her and the little boy, and every time there's quite a lot of humor because he finds her very irritating because she's doing all the things that are uncomfortable or inappropriate. And for Korean viewers as well, this will also stimulate empathy because they'll see where where the older woman is coming from, her mindset and good intentions, and yet she can't quite break through to her grandchildren who are quite Americanized and quite distant from that culture. I'll just play that clip for you now.
Oh, pretty boy, pretty boy, pretty. I'm not pretty. I'm good looking.
And then I've got one more example from Minari. This time it's more a cultural concept than a problem with language. But basically in this scene, Mrs. Yi and her mother prepare Chinese traditional medicine for the boy because he has a heart condition, which they believe is really good for it. And, they're really happy about the various ingredients that are in it. And it's obviously something that's expensive and special. But because David obviously has no experience with traditional Chinese medicine in a Chinese or a Korean context, I mean, he's just never experienced before, he finds the whole situation repulsive, and that creates a tension which is quite funny. And there's numerous scenes in the film where you see him leaving his medicine in different places, abandoning it and wanting to take it. So I'll just play that scene for you now.
좋은 거 다 들어갔어. 용도 들어가고 다 들어갔어.
우리 엄마 돈 많이 썼겠네.
그렇지. 자,
와, 여기 있으면 좋겠다. 아, 돈 많이 썼겠네. 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 잠깐만 이 정도면 되나?
됐어 됐어. 데뷔 먹어봐.
싫어요. 마셔. 할머니가 한국에서 갖고 온 거야.
옳지.
아이고. 싫어. 비싼 거야. 다 마셔. 어유 잘한다. 어이구 착해라.
할머니,
응.
다시는 이런 거 never ever 가져오지 마세요.
Stop, David. 너 매일 한 잔씩 먹을 거야. 잘했어.
Go back.
넣었어.
And tensions like those that I've described also happen at micro scales, which are worth mentioning. For example, in Jopok Manura, also known as My Wife is a Gangster, this happens between the gangster and the and people who and the general public and the man that she marries who isn't a gangster as well. So the film tells the story of Unjin, who's second in command at a local gangster organization, and for her sister's dying wish, she marries a regular guy with the intention of divorcing once her sister's passed away. And the man that she's married has no idea that she's a gangster for a significant portion of the film. And there are many occasions in which the differences in their culture creates tension and humor ensues because obviously those who understand what's happening, the viewers, can see that she appears to be really rude, and in actual fact she's just had a really hard time. So for instance, in this film still that you can see here, unfortunately I couldn't get the video for it, but her husband brings his work colleagues home for a kind of new house party when they first got their new marital home. And when she comes to greet them at the door, she gives a kind of nod and not a very enthusiastic welcome. She isn't really rude, but I mean, you can see, if you know her background, then you can see that she's acting with the same seniority that she does in the gangster organization towards her own husband and his colleagues, as if they were like beneath her. And that tension is quite hilarious throughout the film. Another example, and this again is a little bit different. So in this case, there's intercultural tension, but it's made between the verbal language and the English translation in the subtitle. And this is spoken about quite a lot online. And Bong Joon-ho does this in quite a few of his films, which if you have a chance to watch, I would really recommend because it's quite interesting. So in this film story you can see now, this is from Okja, which is a story about a little girl called Mija who takes care of a giant pig in the mountains for South Korean international conglomerate called Mirando Corporation. Oh, sorry, in the mountains of South Korea for an international conglomerate, Mirando Corporation. And she doesn't know that the pig's going to be slaughtered, but the time comes for the pig to be sent to this company, and it goes, and then she finds out that they're actually planning on killing the pig, and she goes to save it. And when she does so, there's also an animal rights group which is doing the same thing at the same time, but with the intention of using Okja as a mole to expose the Mirando Corporation's animal rights abuse. So they want to hack into the pig's monitoring system to allow her to be taken back to the lab, which Mija doesn't want. Now there's a kind of discussion that takes place between the little girl Mija and the animal rights group, and obviously she doesn't speak English. The group are all Westerners speaking English, and there's one Korean in the group who translates, called Kay, and the leader of the group, Jay, asks Kay to ask Mija if she's okay. He won't go ahead with doing that unless she's okay. Otherwise, she can take the pig and go home. And Kay lies and says she's fine with it when she's not, and they all kind of abandon her there. And right before Kay leaves, he turns to Mija, and he's what he says is, if it's translated from Korean, is my name's Koo Soon Bum. But what it says in the subtitle is, Mija, try learning English, it opens new doors. And this was actually done on purpose. Bong Joon-ho didn't translate it properly because he wanted to make a subversion to the supremacy of English in Korea, because it's the popularity of learning English, and to actually say, well, actually in this case you need to speak Korean or you won't know anything that this guy is saying. And Koo Soon Bum is actually a really kind of old-fashioned, funny sounding name, and quite ridiculous, just a silly joke in there, really. But obviously, yeah, so you have to understand, you have to speak English and see the English subtitle. You have to understand Korean, understand that he didn't translate it, and join the dots together to see that he's making a kind of funny translation joke there. Dr. Hia, did you have any points to make before I go to the next bit?
No, I think we can continue. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the other kind of conflict I mentioned at the beginning was the humor and kind of interesting meanings that come from conflicts when Korean expressions are used incorrectly, particularly when they're excessively polite or excessively rude or inappropriate. So in My Wife is a Gangster, which I gave you an example from previously, the excessive impoliteness of one particular character is used throughout the film to characterize him as a country boy. So if you look at this film still, you can see Eunjin kind of on the right at the front. And even when she's not looking, her subordinates always have their hands clasped in their lap. So whether she's looking at them or not, they always maintain these expressions. However, the guy in the middle, he doesn't care at all. I mean, he's not following protocol. And if you ever see the film, he does it throughout with his eye gaze, his speech styles. And that's quite, excessive impoliteness, and in a situation where he could get beaten up for it, really, within the context of the narrative. And in Korean films, they frequently use this kind of conflict of using the wrong thing at the wrong time, and especially if they do it again and again and again, it becomes a strategy for showing that a person is something, usually something unusual or negative or funny. Park Chan-wook's classic 2003 film Old Boy provides another example of humor created by the conflict of excessive politeness. So briefly on the film, for those of you who haven't seen it, following his release from wrongful imprisonment and on the heels of wreaking revenge, the main character Desu collapses in a sushi restaurant, and Mido, the young woman who you can see in the rear of the image, takes him home and kind of nurses him back to health. And in the morning when he wakes up, she asks him why he fainted. And he proceeds to explain to her that the reason for this is his weakened immunity due to lack of vitamin D. And he gives this whole speech using the formal speech style. And given that Mido is much younger than him, it's completely unnecessary using that speech style. And what's inferable by his choice of speech style is that he's speaking a little bit like a television narrator or presenter, that he's maybe copying something he's heard verbatim that he's seen on television, maybe even an advert. And this serves to create humor because it shows the effect the incarceration had on him. And of course, I mean, if you haven't watched Korean news anchors when they speak, or Korean documentaries, you won't have kind of heard this way of speaking and be able to instantly pick up on it.
It's very funny in a way that when you kind of when you encounter some formal speech style in, completely informal situation by someone who doesn't seem to, show the necessary formality, it creates humor. So it's very kind of interesting, but again, difficult to translate and normally untranslatable and leaves only visible to Korean viewers. So we laugh, but actually difficult for non-Korean viewers to understand why this is funny.
Then we have the misalignment of verbal and non-verbal, which, as I said before, creates unusual meanings. And again, we use Old Boy here as another example. In this scene, Dae-soo meets his captor Woo-jin for the first time since his release. And when he meets him, speech styles play a really important role, and so do nonverbal expressions, and when they're aligned and when they're not, in characterizing Woo-jin and kind of showing not just what kind of person he is, but how mentally well he is. So in the first part of the conversation, Woo-jin speaks mostly using a polite speech style, in spite of actually imprisoning Dae-soo and clearly hating him, which already shows misalignment. But then there's a particular moment where a switch occurs, which is when the aggressive tension is growing, and it's only then when he actually switches into Panmal. And interestingly, his facial expression doesn't change at all. So unlike a Hollywood movie, if someone's really angry, they shout, they raise their voice, and their face is very expressive, but he's very still, very unexpressive, and just simply changes to Panmal. And it's around the time when Dae-soo raises a hammer to his head. And this change in speech style is sufficient in expressing his true bad feelings, and also confirming that the misalignment that he previously had in this polite speech style, with a person who he clearly hates, it serves to show that that was insincere, and it also helps to characterize him throughout the film as quite insane and quite dangerous. And there's a similar thing that happens in the Korean classic Chingu, which is a film that centers on two best friends who start out in the same gang, but then join different gangs and end up becoming enemies because of a kind of long-term resentment by one of them, Dong-soo. And in the scene in this still, Jun-sok tries to warn Dong-soo that he needs to leave town because Jun-sok's gang is going to murder him over the murder of one of Jun-sok's men. And Dong-soo, as usual, speaks in Panmal throughout. His nonverbal expressions are very dominant, very confident. I mean, the opposite of what a junior would do to a senior, and even a little bit rude between friends, because Koreans like to be polite even to their friends. So everything's in line. His rude nonverbal expressions, informal speech style. But then when they discuss the gang member who was murdered, who Dong-soo is pretending he did a murder, when he gets to the point where he lies, he instantly changes into a polite speech style, and only for that sentence. So the misalignment serves to show the insincerity and the dishonesty. And this strategy, if you watch Korean films and you come across these moments, if you try to pick up on it, you'll hear that this strategy comes out again and again and again, because it serves to show that what the person is doing and what they're thinking are different. Now I'll give some examples of conflict and meaning, starting with excessive politeness. So this is a really common strategy in Korean films, and one great example is Veteran, which tells the story of a detective who won't give up on trying to arrest this super rich, really bad guy called Teo, who murders an employee who tries to seek justice. And Teo frequently uses excessive politeness to be sarcastic, and this is used in the film to characterize him as insane and dangerous, and also to indicate the danger of the characters who are with him when he's behaving like this. It usually precedes doing something very evil or follows doing something very evil. So in this still, you can see that Teo and the man who you can only see the back of his head, but that's Detective So, and they're eating dinner with Teo's friends. And first, Teo assaults the women at the dinner table just for no reason at all. And then he climbs onto the table and starts saying 죄송합니다, and which is a very formal way of apologizing, or kind of excuse me, but apologizing, and at the same time performing a kunjol bow, which is reserved usually for special occasions and traditional ceremonies. And it involves being on your knees and leaning all the way forward. While the assault on the women before this and climbing on the table are already very extreme behaviors, using this bow and speaking in such a formal manner during a party, even to an older person, shows his sarcasm. So, you know, even without that, it would have served the same purpose in the film. And again, excessive politeness when it's completely unnecessary. In My Wife is a Gangster, there's one scene where Unjin is trying to find a husband, and she goes on a date with a matchmaker, and she has to find some fake parents, which her gang kind of, they find these street food sellers and threaten them, make them pretend to be a mum and dad. And at some point during the date, they're asked to leave the table, to leave Unjin with her potential husband alone to talk. And they stand up and do around a 30-degree bow to her before rushing off. And what this serves to show is fear, because, I mean, they lack confidence completely and they're afraid of what she's going to do to them. In actuality, their seniority, had she not been a gangster, should win out, because they have no relation to each other that would... you know, they're not family members, they're not friends, they're not colleagues. So the only hierarchy that's relevant is age. So that creates humor in this scene. Another example I have of conflicting hierarchies and complex meaning potential that can arise is from the film A Bittersweet Life, which is the story of a gangster called Sun Woo, who loses favor with his boss Kang after he covers up for the boss's girlfriend having an affair. And this leads his boss to attempt to murder him, which is unsuccessful, and then he comes for revenge. And this seems quite early on in the film, but it's when Sun Woo and Kang are having a meal together. And at this point, they're very close. You know, Kang is kind of like a father figure to him, which is why he seeks revenge, because, you know, he's kind of surprised why he tried to kill him. And they're having dinner, and they're interrupted by a fellow gang member who is about the same rank as Sun Woo, but he's actually a little bit older. And the gang member obviously feels that he's at least equal, if not more, to Sun Woo, and is ignoring the intimacy between Kang and Sun Woo. And he waltzes in and he sits down and just starts eating and talking as if he'd been invited. And then he's reprimanded by Kang and told to leave. The underlying feeling, I mean, if you weren't aware of the conflict in hierarchy that's happening here between the gangster who's just interrupted his age seniority, and the power that the intimacy between Kang and Sun Woo gives Sun Woo, if you're not aware of that conflict happening, it just appears that he's come in and he's a bit rude, and then he gets told to leave, and that's annoying. But what this actually is the very early stages of a grudge between Sun Woo and the other gangster, which, when it comes time to for the boss Kang to fall out with him, then that comes into play in that. So it's quite important. And you can see that clip now.
그래, 어제 일은
네, 처리했습니다.
잘했다. 항상 네가 수고하는구나. 백 회장 아들놈이 하나 있는데 그게 말썽을 좀 피나 보더라.
예, 백 회장이 직접 나서는 것 같진 않고 사채업을 하던 백 사장이란 친구가 최근에 이쪽 일에 손을 대기 시작했단 말을 들었습니다.
전복입니다.
얼마 전에 동남아 쪽 연예기획사하고 거래를 떴다는 얘기가 돌고 있어요.
그건 왜?
러시아 애들 거래 끊고 필리핀 쪽 연예인들 좀 받아달라고 이 지역 업소에 압력을 좀 넣고 있는 모양입니다.
야, 진짜 늙어이나 자식놈이나 욕심들은.
저 왔습니다. 문석입니다. 아휴, 차는 왜 갖고 나와가지고 길을. 아이고 말씀 중이셨나봐요. 됐어. 이거 뭐야? 전복? 나도 이거부터 갖다 줘. 참. 어제 미안하다. 그냥 잠시 비운 사이에 그런 일이 생겼냐. 위층도 바빴을 텐데. 어제 일이요? 그 동네 애들입니다. 뭐 신경 안 쓰셔도 될 것 같습니다.
너 뭐 하는 놈이야?
예?
그런 식으로 할래?
그거
나가 있어.
걔네들
들어가서 대기해.
Okay. Another a really good example of conflicting hierarchy and the meanings, the interesting meanings that come out of that. Most of which are invisible is this clip from Bong Joon-ho's Parasite. I'm sure most of you have seen this film, but just in case you haven't, it's a film about the destitute Kim family who scheme their way into the household of the super rich Park family. And in this scene, this is right at the beginning of the film, and they have a dispute with their boss, who happens to be about a generation younger than them. And the conflicting hierarchies result in the young boss's expressions showing her abuse of power. And this may not be visible to non-Koreans who, for whom age seniority doesn't exist, especially since the Kims are kind of depicted as shoddy box folders who perhaps don't make that much of an effort. They're getting free Wi-Fi from the cafe next door, and because at the beginning of the film, you have no other information to go on. So I'll just play that clip for you.
적으로 뭐가 문제예요?
아니 예를 들면 여기 한 봐요. 라인이 아주 드럽게 접혔죠? 이거 왜 접혀 있는 건데? 이거 왜 튀어나와요? 그럼 접다 만 거잖아요, 지금. 아까 전체 다 보니까 박스 4개 한 개 걸로 이런 상태야. 넷 중 하나는 불량인 거지.
그래서 정말 돈 10% 떼고 주겠다는 거예요, 지금?
불량률에 비하면 페널티 적은 거지, 안 그래요?
이거 얼마나 한다고? 너무한 거 아니에요?
이봐요. 이게 그렇게 간단한 문제가 아니야. 이런 불량 박스 하나하나가 얼마나 큰 데미지를 주는 줄 알아요? 우리 브랜드 이미지에?
브랜드. 박스 접을 사람도 하나 없는 것들이,
뭐라고?
My apologies that I didn't have English subtitles, but a really important thing that I want to mention is that throughout this conversation, the young pizza boss slips in and out of Panmal and John Denmark, and she's always going in and out. It's like she's dancing across the line of rudeness. And I mean, where she's definitely being rude, no mistake about it, is the close proximity at which she holds the pizza box to Mrs. Kim, because she's a lot older than her, and she really, putting items that close to people is, invading their personal space is a really big deal in Korea. But also shaking the item very vigorously is, there's no dancing in between the line there. It's just rude. Dr. Kier, I don't know if you had anything.
Yeah, I think this is what we discussed yesterday. So I think we can go to the next slide. So there's tension between these two, and very funny as well. Like
적으로 뭐가 문제예요?
no, yeah.
Shall I go?
Lori, do you have the slide that I sent you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is I think someone asked me about the Park Seung-bin, linguistic justice equality. So Park Seung-bin is the 1880 to 1943. He was born in 1880, and he tried to bring. He was actually not linguistic, but he was a lawyer. But he was educated in Japan. But he really wanted to bring sort of like some sort of more justice, like more equal system. At least calling each other the best way, and the way how he thought that perhaps we need something sort of like English you, second person pronoun, but the way how he and his colleagues decided is to use the word she for everyone, like rather than having different address terms. He thought maybe in this way we can create more efficient, equal, and society with the linguistic justice, and that was his vision in the old days. But as I talked about before, it didn't really happen. But something that we can also talk about. Lori, do you have the next slide? So yeah, so this is another talk that I want to introduce you. 21st of May, in Oxford, we have sort of open discussion talk about Romanization and linguistic equality and justice language use. So I'm not going to talk about Park Seung-bin a lot, but then if you want to join, please register. This is a free talk, and half of the talk will be about Romanization, and the half of the talk will be about linguistic. So yeah, this how we can improve equality and the inequality and bring justice. But I will talk about Park Seung-bin. So if you are interested in Park Seung-bin and his linguistic philosophy, please do join, and you can listen to the talk. And thank you so much for joining us throughout this week. And this is what we the talks that we have given this week is based on what we Lori and I, based on the book that we just finished, Understanding Korean Film. So please do follow us. We are just launching Twitter, so if you want to follow us, and we will bring more talk information, or we'll upload the talk in May too in this Twitter. But yeah, please follow us, and then we'll send you the information and invites. And this is the book that probably come out later this year. And yeah, that's everything from us. Any question? I know we don't have enough time, but maybe a few questions. And if you have some more questions, do please leave a message in the Twitter or be in touch with myself or Lori. Yeah, maybe a question or one or two.
Yeah, thank you very much for Jiun and the Loli's speech. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to leave your questions. Okay, if not, okay, yeah. Okay, so yeah, once again, so let me close the webinar today. So thank you, Professor Jin Kea and Miss Loli for your efforts and presentation today. And it's actually unusual to experience this kind of intellectual opportunity to understand various Korean language and culture. And I also wish to appreciate all of your participants in recent 5 days, including today, for your participation, questions to each lecture, and also your interest in Korean language in general. And I also strongly appreciate to Korean Education Center for organizing this wonderful opportunity. And please keep visiting the websites and social media such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram of the Korean Embassy in the UK, the Korean Education Center, and the government of the Republic of Korea, so that we can keep providing you with notifications of future events. And I hope that any content in recent 5 days will be helpful for you and support your connection to Korea. Lastly, so I hope you are enjoying a sunny and peaceful Friday, and you are going to have the lovely weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you as well.
Thanks millions.
Thank you.
수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다. 예.
감사합니다.
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 감사합니다.